Hi, everybody that joins. We'll give it a second or so for everybody to join. Well, it looks like there's quite a few joined. So welcome everybody. It's great to welcome you in 2021 and the 21st of January. It's great to say that we welcome you at our new facility, our test labs. So we're broadcasting this webinar from our new facility, which we're really excited to announce as well. So today we'll be talking about a subject of an effective ultraviolet or UVC light dose. And sorry, just trying to change the slide. We'll try and cover. We'll give a brief introduction of what UVC light is. We'll talk about the microbiological effects. What sort of parameters do affect the efficacy, and then how do we what would be the best way of combining UVC disinfection and manual cleaning? We'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please use the Q&A tab to post any of the questions, and we'll attempt to do our best to try and answer as many of them as we can at the end of it. So today I'm joined by Enrico Allegra. He's our lead microbiologist at Inivos.
Hi.
And with that, I'd like to hand over to yourself, Enrico.
Thank you. So thank you very much to be with us today. So we'd like to very briefly introduce the concept of UV light. Probably many of you are quite familiar with all this, with this slide in particular. So UV has been a proven disinfection method for many, many years. And it's been employed to sort of disinfect water, air, and surfaces, which, as we know, are the main vectors of transmission of infection diseases. And it's been used in a variety of applications, including in the healthcare settings, agriculture, food, the airplanes, water control, and many more. The germicidal irradiation UV light, or UVGI, covers a wavelength between the 100 to 400 nanometers. Within this range is then further divided into 4 spectral areas, which are UVA, UVB, UVC, and vacuum UV. Today, we'll primarily focus on UVC light, as we'll show, and it's proven to be the most effective. So if we move on to my next slide, we can start talking about the mechanism of action, or UVC, and how efficacy is achieved. So germicidal efficacy with UVC light, it's due to a process called photodimerization. So what this means that UVC will penetrate the nuclei, and it will interact directly with the nucleic acids of various organisms, i.e. DNA or RNA, and it will cause dimers between pyrimidine bases. In the case of DNA, also it's talking about thymine. In the case of RNA, we're talking about uracil. And these photodimers so these will basically lead to a generation of photoproducts. These photoproducts, such as cyclobutane pyrimidine or the pyrimidine 6,4 pyrimidone, will lead to several DNA damages. So these DNA damages are due to the inability of these bacteria to be able to then replicate and to perform the RNA transcription. This will eventually lead to cell death and other mutagenesis, and that's how sort of efficacy is achieved. It's been shown in many studies and many literature reviews that the 254 nanometers wavelength seems to have the strongest germicidal activity. And if we move on to my next slide, this is further explained. So many studies have been done assessing the kind of the penetration, kind of the absorbance of energy inside sort of the cells, and at 254 nanometers, it seems to have the highest absorbance in both RNA and DNA, which then led to obviously will lead to the highest efficacy, although this is still being discussed as others wavelength within the UVC spectrum have been, especially lately, have been more and more used and adopted. But I guess the 254 nanometers, it's something we can almost refer as the golden standards, as the most the most common use wavelength for UVC light. Has proven a very wide spectral activity, obviously going against bacteria, viruses, and spores at the same time. Just to briefly mention, the UVA and UVB, which are not very discussed in this presentation, have been shown to have much less inactivation, so will achieve less efficacy against bacteria. Hence, that's why UVC is the most it's the most used at the moment. So if we then move onto my next slide, we can start sort of talking about what we call the kinetics of UVC light. So I think we need to understand a bit more how the sort of what we call dose level are achieved. So obviously the UV decontamination, decontamination UVC, it's an energy-based process, which means the microbial inactivation is determined by what is called the delivered sort of UV dose via the decontaminating unit, which means how to calculate what we refer as the D, i.e. the UVC dose. You basically you're multiplying the delivered irradiance or the fluence rate by the exposure times. So obviously, basically, it's the irradiance versus how long you're exposing a certain microorganism to your UVC equipment. And another parameter we're going to introduce now is called the Z value. So the Z value refers specifically to the required dose to inactivate any specific organism. So therefore, Z values are not unique. There cannot be such a thing as one Z value per equipment, for example, per system. Z values are inherently related to bacteria sensitivity and microorganism sensitivity. So bacteria will differ from viruses, which will differ from spores, for example, and from fungi. As each one of these species has a difference in the membrane, in the protective defensive mechanism that they can adapt and they can use, and therefore your Z values will differ according to all these principles. On top of that, something that we've been seeing more and more, that there are several other parameters that are also contributing to what the Z value will be. These other parameters are the distance, obviously, of your unit to the surfaces or to the decontamination target. Whether or not there's shadows present, the presence of soiling and dirt, so these all contribute to different Z values and will contribute to different values, basically to those different doses, depending on all of these parameters, which basically now we've started to introduce, started to make what we want to say here is that all these parameters have to be taken into consideration in order to achieve, in order to also be able to back up any data that's supporting a specific Z value against a specific organism. So if we move on to my next slide, we have a couple of examples of Z values and in terms of log reduction and what this means. So as I just described, different microorganisms will have different susceptibility to the UVC doses. In the case of bacteria, as we know, there are two main groups of bacteria, gram-positive and gram-negative. The difference is mainly due to the membrane structure, where gram-negative tend to have a thinner peptidoglycan layer, where gram-positive tends to obviously have a thicker cell wall membrane. This seems to help in the susceptibility and in the case of gram-positive, in the increased resistance to UVC dose and UVC penetration. And in fact, from the table below, you can see if we compare, for example, E. coli, which is a gram-negative, versus MRSA, which is a Staph aureus, so it's a multi-drug resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is a gram-positive, with a very similar Z value, we are achieving very different log reduction, i.e. there's a 3 log reduction, which in microbiological term, it's quite a huge gap in between the two. And this is just to show, to make understand that if you were to use the same Z value for every application, you will not achieve the required log reduction. So very careful, and we need to, again, understand more of all these parameters. We need to understand what the challenge is in order then to apply the correct dose. And moving on to the next slide, there's a very similar example done with viruses. So the same idea where we can almost broadly describe viruses in 2 main groups, envelope and non-envelope viruses. Also, there's many more other parameters that kind of involves, but if we kind of look at the bigger picture, envelope viruses seems to have more resistance to UVC dose, very similar concept to gram-positive and gram-negative versus non-envelope viruses. And when, for example, we compare influenza viruses versus the adenovirus, in order to achieve a log 3 reduction, half the dose which was delivered to the influenza virus to only achieve a log 2 reduction was needed for the adenovirus. This kind of, again, shows what we, again, trying to say here, that perhaps more research, more understanding is needed on how and where these Z values are coming from and how we're calculating the Z value. And one more, I'm just going to touch briefly on the sort of coronavirus. It's been I think, in the last, obviously, year, a huge surge into, obviously, new papers and publications versus coronavirus, and a lot of research has been done, especially using UVC light, and different Z values sometimes are reported. For example, in this case, to achieve log 1, only 292 millijoule per square centimeter were needed. For a log 6 is 1,048. But again, we can't assume anything from these values because we are missing other information. We're missing distance, for example. We are missing what's the total time, and we're missing other parameters which may contribute to these Z values. So moving on to my next slide, we now talk about very quick. I'll go very quickly through the last 2 slides. We just wanted to introduce this concept, which has been, we've seen in the literature now. And more people have started talking about it, and it's microbial resistance, UV light. So some organisms, and especially bacteria, seem to have shown a slight, some sort of an increased resistance to UV light. We know, again, from the literature, we've seen that there's 2 main mechanisms. One is an enzymatic DNA repairing mechanism, where the bacteria are physically repairing damages as they occur. And then an increased cell size. So one of the studies that we've seen, an E. coli strain was exposed over a period of 60 days, and with repeated increased dose. And we noticed, and what they noticed was that the dose had to be increased each time to achieve the same efficacy, and the variation, so the modification occurred within the cells, were all due to the cell size. So the cell size seems to have increased for this E. coli strain. And the increased cell size seems to have had some sort of help the bacteria surviving, and therefore to needed a higher dose and higher irradiance actually to achieve the same efficacy, the same dose level. I just wanted to sort of touch on this by saying how important it is to understand the right dose, because if we give the right dose of bacteria, we will be able to eliminate and eradicate the challenge. And it's the same concept that we have with antibiotics in general, where you need to take the full course of antibiotics to fully eradicate your bacteria. And if you only take a 3-day, if you only take your antibiotics for 3 days rather than for 5 days as prescribed, although you feel better and you feel like your infection is gone, all you're doing is leaving behind some bacteria which have been exposed to the antibiotics and eventually will start develop resistance. And again, that's the same concept of UV light. We don't want to leave too much behind. We want to be able to eradicate, to kill the dose, come in with the correct dose and be able to eradicate everything to avoid a surge in resistance. And on to my last slide before passing on to Tautvydas. I want to just briefly touch about relative humidity. So we know again, from studies, we've seen that RH seems to offer some sort of protection to bacteria, especially a high level of relative humidity, where, for example, this study showed that influenza virus, although the same exact dose was applied to different RH in the rooms was where obviously was set up, and the inactivation, sort of the inactivation of influenza virus dropped from 99% to 77% using the same 250 millijoule. And these kind of this study kind of showed that especially influenza virus was statistically different. So the inactivation of influenza virus was statistically different in relation to the RH. So again, and yet again, another parameters that we need to take into consideration. And again, it may play a role on our final Z value and why perhaps we're achieving certain doses in certain circumstances and certain environment, and why we are achieving different doses, although we're using the same organism in another environment. And now we'll pass on to Tautvydas. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico. I think it's really good and it's really interesting information. And I suppose I'm trying to summarize to say, well, where we are today. And I think it's fair to say that UVC light is used more than ever to disinfect hard surfaces and air. That's the feedback we're getting. And that clearly led to, more data being published on UVC light effectiveness and, how UVC technology is being employed to try and deal with the immediate problem. Clearly, we have a global pandemic and there's a lot more data suggesting different, doses, etc. So I suppose what we're finding and what the feedback that we're getting is that some studies are starting to report different effective UVC light doses on the same group of organisms. And especially it can get really confusing and really hard to compare different technologies and see, which one is right and how do you make sense out of it. And I think we're trying to identify, looking at all of the different studies and different methods being applied to do the test, the potential causes could potentially be that these results don't really state all the parameters. So it's difficult to say without knowing all the calibration values. In fact, we don't really know whether the equipment being used is calibrated correctly, or maybe different studies had used different calibration methods and therefore getting different results. Most studies don't really state the different wavelengths that they're testing or dose rates, or how long did it take to get at the same dose, etc. There's no mention of temperature, relative humidity, which we now know, and there's quite a few studies showing that all of these have an impact on any of the reported effective dose values. So I think based with the whole microbial sensitivity to UVC doses, it's great to say that we have a bit of a challenge to say, how do you make sense of all the data that's being presented? And generally speaking, when you look at UVC light technologies, to simplify, there's probably three different groups of systems out there. So you start with systems that, well, the first group of systems that in a way measure nothing or make no claims. And without the obvious challenge or issue with those sort of systems is that, well, if you don't make really any claims, how effective can you be at doing whatever you intend to do? The other obvious problem is that if we do use a UVC light source that's not really fit for purpose, we are likely to try and introduce this resistant mechanism that Enrico just spoke about. So that's how we probably look at the first group of systems. Now, the second group of systems do go, and try and state an efficacy, dose or time, etc. And some of the systems are trying to do as little as possible, or try and choose a single organism and claim effective dose on that specific type of organism, which in this case is whatever is in the current challenge. And I think the obvious problem with that is that, well, if your current challenge is a coronavirus, which is evidently easy to kill, or you get your Z value, it's likely that you're going to try and use the same equipment or technology you've invested to try and decontaminate your future challenges, which may be C. diff or VRE. And from what Enrico was saying, that your Z values are different for those sort of organisms, thus they clearly are impacted by all the different parameters. So the challenge is like, how do we know to make sure that whatever we're using is actually fit for purpose? And then there's the third category of systems that try and have a feedback mechanism to try and determine the correct dose in different environments to try and validate the process. So when you look at the whole challenge, is that how do you go and use all that information to make sure that you get the right level of efficacy in all of those environments? Now, what we see from all the studies that it's well documented the fact that your efficacy will be reduced if you move as far as you move from your light source. And I suppose the way technology developers are going about this issue, well, you just run it for longer to get the same dose. Well, the question that we are asking, and I suppose we need to see more studies, is what the effect is on your dose rate. So you may as well achieve the same Z value, but your Z value should be 100 millijoules per square centimeter per 5 minutes at this temperature, at this relative humidity, as a fuller picture to see how effective that is. And you may find that the same dose at different rates could have a different effect. And it's well documented, the fact that if you have the same light source, like in this study here, at the different distances, giving the same amount of exposure in minutes, you get, well, as further you get, the less efficacious the process is. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that obviously different doses have different response in a way of killing microorganisms. I think what we need to find out is that do we need to achieve that dose in a specific amount of time to make sure that we do kill everything and we don't leave bacteria behind and potentially causing any of the resistance being developed. I suppose it's interesting to see that if we have all those challenges by trying to make sense and test all the equipment and technologies to try and support the validation reports, when you go into the actual environment, which is filled with different parameters, so we have different, there's shadowing, there's different sort of soiling, different configuration of all the rooms. When you put that in the mix, it becomes really difficult to see how do you transfer all the claims that you're making from all the validation reports and all the literature into your real environment. As we know that all of these things do differ. So I think the challenge is that if we do go and invest into technology with a set of claims, well, we need to ask the question, how do we make sure that we get the same results every single time we deploy those systems? And it's clear to say that UVC light do have a limitation where any kind of soiling would limit the effectiveness of UVC light. So I think there's a UVC light is a good combination when combined with manual cleaning. And there's numerous studies to support the fact that this study here shows that these are UVC counts before manual cleaning, after the manual cleaning, and after UVC light intervention. So if we're trying to get the conditions as close as we can to the conditions that we from the test laboratories and all the reports, we may have a better chance of getting the same level of efficacy. I suppose what we are calling for is for more tests to find out exactly what other parameters do influence that Z value. So when you look at those reports, you're able to make sense to say, okay, well, if these are the claims that are being made, really need to make sure that those UVC technologies or devices are actually effective in the setting and they actually are used as intended. So I suppose to summarize that UVC is shown to be an effective method for disinfection of water surfaces in air. And there's no denying, and it's good to see that more industries are employing technology. I think what we have to make sure that we use the right technology with the right parameters to make sure that 2025 still sees UVC light as an effective way of fighting against bacteria, rather than contributing to the massive amount of bacteria that become suddenly resistant to UVC light. At the moment, it seems like 254 nanometer has been shown to provide the optimal genicidal activity. There's more data to come from the UVC wavelength. I think there's more data required to show whether that's as effective or if not more effective. And effective UVC light, those do vary significantly from microorganism to another microorganism. And that's important to understand that if you look at the data set, then how do you extrapolate that data to any of the other assumptions? So if you're investing in UVC light technology, well, what is the right amount of set of data to make sure that all the organisms that you're hoping to decontaminate against are included in all the test results? So efficacy of UVC light is significantly influenced by several parameters. So we know that the shadowing distance, in fact, we suspect that time taken to achieve that efficacy, temperature and humidity do play a vital role. So we need to make sure that when we look at those tests, we understand how we compare. And this may be the reason why we see differences in different doses reported for the same organism. In fact, looking at the whole history of literature reporting specific dose values for the same organism, since 1940s, I think the date where we use some upon to now, we see that an increased dose has been reported years over years, but this might be to do with the fact that we're getting better at measuring, better at reporting, but therefore it could also mean that these microorganisms need more UVC light to die. So all the parameters like distance of the shadowing, soiling, and other parameters do have an impact in the effective UVC light dose. And I think these are definitely worth mentioning. So I think we're going to try and go into the Q&A session to see if there's any question. I think there's one question that says, is there an accepted minimum dose and range of doses to SARS-CoV deactivation? Would you like to go and answer that, Enrico, based on all the literature reviews? I suppose the question is that, is there like a minimum dose that you would expect to see for SARS-CoV-2 disinfection? I think from your previous slides, I think it was suggesting that 148, I think, millijoules per square centimeter was the effective dose to achieve log 6 reduction.
Well, yeah, actually, sorry, my connection just went a little bit unstable there. Actually, yeah, I mean, that, I think one thing we can say for certain, there isn't a minimum, like there isn't an accepted like minimum dose for it. I mean, you actually was said in my slide, actually had an example, I think for log 6 reduction, they had 1048 millijoule per square centimeter. And we actually just seen a paper being published last month where they had a ranges of log reduction, and actually to achieve the log 5 reduction, they claim their system made it in 108 millijoule per square centimeter, 10 times basically lower than the other reported. So I guess what we're trying to say is the usual. It's be very difficult to say that's your Z value, go and use it, because it's very dependent on the system you're using and all the other parameters that we're showing. And again, it's in a very difficult situation to just say yes, although probably we would love to just, hey, that's what you need, that's the dose, go and use it. It's a bit more complicated than that, and I think that's why we need a lot more research, a lot more kind of understanding of all these other parameters to kind of then give it, there you go.
I think ultimately for any of those doses to be meaningful, I suppose there's, we can throw numbers saying, yeah, this is an effective dose. Well, okay, well, how do you use that information to make sure that, this is the dose you get into your, wherever you're trying to implement UVC technology. So I think that there's a need for better integration of any of the results that we're getting, or the wider, scientific community is publishing this. How does this integrate into all of the UVC devices and technologies that we employ on a daily basis to try and fight against whatever the challenge that we currently have. Now, there's a question saying, how about equipment validation and certification? Can you share information about accepted standards and how harmful doses for persons? So I suppose UVC exposure to humans is well researched, and there's clearly safety limits, and therefore when you use UVC light, high intensity UVC light, you don't expect any humans to be inside present, being exposed to direct UVC light. So the standards there. Now at the moment, there isn't any standard to go and test your efficacy against UVC, and I know the BSI are working on one, so hopefully we'll see that in the future. But clearly a standard that will go and assess all the different technologies to give them, some sort of a level playing field would it's definitely welcome for the industry to make sure that it's easier to compare different technologies. And one of the questions is it possible to measure the dose of UV at a specific point? And the answer is yes, and that's how the trials are being done. So if you look at all of the tests or some of the reports or studies, they do measure the dose. That's how they arrive at that value of whatever the Z value is. I think what the information that sometimes is missing is, how long did it take to get that specific Z value, and what was the circumstances, or what are the other parameters like temperature, humidity, to try and give a fuller picture. Because I suppose the risk is that if you use that Z value and you achieve the same value, twice as long time, is it still effective? There's a question: where are these devices available? Where are you with the FDA? Do you also have? I think this might be a slightly unrelated question to the webinar, so perhaps we'll answer that separately to that.
I can take the following one if you want, very briefly, on photoreactivation. And I guess we did have it briefly on my slide. So it was one of the mechanisms of repairing is enzymatic DNA repair. Mm-hmm. So we are aware of it. There is a mechanism for bacteria to immediately almost repair the dimers. So it's just one way they're able to do it, I guess. So we are kind of considering it.
I think it's fair to say, Enrico, that we hoping to go and test that. So I suppose we're hoping, we looked at all the research. It seems that there's not a lot to try and suggest, how these organisms would develop the defense mechanisms against the UVC light. So what we're hoping to do in the coming months is to try and determine an effective UVC dose from whatever the UVC light source that we would pick, and then try and, in a way, half that, expose the organism to it, see if we can actually, get the bacteria to, or whatever the organism would choose to try and develop the resistance, to see whether that's actually the thing. Because if that's the case, well, therefore we definitely would have to call for, better UVC understanding. How do we go about this, so we don't see years ahead of UVC not being the right tool. There's a question about will you achieve the same log reduction of specific organism, which, for example, well, there's a specific dose, which is 500 millijoules per square centimeter if applied at in the different distances. I suppose this is exactly our point, that I suppose if you refer just to the dose, clearly you can get that dose within 10 minutes, 5 minutes, a year even. And we're trying to find out if it's, if you are going to get the same efficacy. And this is the information that's somewhat lacking. And this is where we're hoping to plug that gap and follow this webinar up with our own research to try and, make sense of what's going to happen. If you're hoping to achieve the same dose at different times, at different rates. There's a question about, is there an accepted dose for air disinfection? And it's a very hot topic, and I guess there's a lot of frustration to say that, well, how do you go and test air decontamination systems or air disinfection systems that use technology? And it is challenging. And we're hoping to share some of the information about all the test methods that we found. But I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of good attempts being made to try and showcase different technologies. But I think we're far along away from having a unified test method where we can go and say, each of the technology manufacturers, go and get and test those systems to see how you compare. Enrico, do you want to comment on that? But I think we spoke about every day, like we get this feedback, like how do you test this air purification? Is UVC going to be effective if you put it in the duct? And we're thinking, well, looking at the research, there's a lot happening, but it's difficult to make sense of recommendation based on those, based on the results that are being presented.
As I said, that's something that we hoping to get ourselves into, and trying to, have. I think the main thing that we all want to do is to create an actual method. We want to create, some sort of standardized way of actually testing all this. Especially, when we're talking about yeah, I guess at the moment it's the answer would be no, but I guess we need to, we need to be able to understand more. I think also because I think we see a lot of claims that UVC, for example, systems are great at disinfecting air. I think it's the biggest claim that is shown in the literature by a lot of, so I guess, and again, then the dose dependent to that, I think it's much more complex than just say you need X amount of dose and your room will be fully disinfected. And it kind of ties in with another question underneath, kind of your standard exposure time. I guess you could have some sort of standard exposure time. I guess if your system was able to also validate what's happening in the room, contemporarily, that would be even better. But to be able to just advise on a standard exposure time, again, it depends on your challenge and depends on of other parameters that we sort of mentioned before. It depends, for example, if the room has been cleaned beforehand, manual cleaning, etc., etc. So.
And I think it's fair to say that UVC technology clearly is finding its own feet to try and be an effective tool to try and support infection prevention and control measures. And it's good to see how many different industries and healthcare are embracing the technology and trying to use that. Well, there's a better call for all the manufacturers and all the developers to see how do we improve from here. And I think with the current set of information that we have, we've done as much as we could. We know that there's a value you need to reach. Well, certain technology manufacturing developers, know absolutely the fact that what is the value they need to reach? How do they assure the fact that they get that? And we welcome that. But I think what we are trying to do is we're trying to go ahead and say, what do we do now? Well, where to from now, kind of. So so that we don't create something that causes issues in the long run. And there's clearly some gaps in the knowledge. And I suppose from all the feedback that we're getting, people getting frustrated with seeing different numbers, different doses, and they don't really know how to do it and start questioning their own technologies. And this is where we're coming from, that there's a lot more research need to be done. And we're hoping to try and answer that. Obviously, we won't be able to do that all alone. So we're saying, like, if we start this conversation, we start this topic to say, are we still effective even if we get the same dose? Is there other parameters that we need to consider? So instead of just noting the dose, we know the time, temperature, humidity, anything else that may affect the value. Are we actually training these bacteria or viruses how to resist UVC light? It may seem crazy questions, but at the same time, we don't want to get in a position where that's a reality that we have to do, face going forward. And there's a final question that, yes, we'll share the recording, and I think you'll find that on our new website. So really appreciate everybody joining. It's really nice to be back running the webinar series. We're hoping to keep this up, and we'll do a webinar every month on any of those topics. And we're hoping to be able to share going forward more of our own research that we're hoping to conduct with our new capabilities here. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.